Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2024 Minnesota Book Awards finalists in the competitive genre fiction category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota and the genre fiction category through the generosity of Macalester College. My name is Andrew DeYoung. I'm the author of The Exo Project, a Minnesota Book Award winner in 2018, The Temps, a Minnesota Book Award finalist in this category last year, and The Day He Never Came Home, a domestic thriller forthcoming in July of this year. And I'm very pleased to be here with some of my fellow Minnesota authors today. As we get started, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, Indigenous keepers of the land on which most of us on this panel are recording today. This land was reserved for the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow Indigenous inhabitants of this land. The Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of story in this place, now called Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, honor this tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we all work together to lift up storytellers in our state. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by CM Alongi, author of Citadel, published by Blackstone Publishing; Emma Torzs, author of Ink, Blood, Sister Scribe, published by William Morrow, HarperCollins Publishers; Naomi Kritzer, author of Liberty's Daughter, published by Fairwood Press; and Tashia Hart, author of Native Love Jams, self-published. Congratulations to each of you for the finalist nod. I've been in your position and know how exciting it is. In the interest of making the most of our short time together, I'm going to begin with a round robin question that I'd like each of you to respond to in turn. I'll then have a question specific to each of you and your wonderful finalist book. So for the round robin, you are this year's finalists in genre fiction. Genre can mean many things, but in this context, it refers to the commercial genres of science fiction, fantasy, romance, and mystery or thriller. I'm curious to hear from each of you. What is your relationship to the genre label? Do you each think of yourselves as genre writers? And do you consciously engage with genre tropes in your writing, whether to adopt them or discard them? And we'll start today with Naomi. Love to hear from you about this.
Thank you. So when I was thinking about this question, I like probably most writers, I was a reader before I was a writer. And so my first engagement with genre labels was as a reader who was looking for things that I liked to read. And as a child, I figured out pretty quickly that the science fiction books, the fantasy books, and the mystery books, all of, which commercially children's books tend to all get shelved together, but I mean, I was looking for, that was what I was looking for as a reader. Some of the first books I really loved included A Wrinkle in Time, which is science fiction, The Westing Game, which is mystery, The Hero and the Crown, which is fantasy. Those are all books that I read over and over and over when I was little. So as a writer, I went to genre because it was my favorite thing to read, and I was writing things that I wanted to read from the very beginning. In terms of consciously engaging in tropes, engaging with tropes, I the book Liberty's Daughter, when I first started writing it, I had, it was written as short stories, and I handed the first one out to my writers group. And one of the people in my critique group, Doug Hulick's comment was, this is noir. You're writing noir here, and there's a beat that you missed. And I was like, I was not intending to write noir. And he was like, too bad. That's absolutely what you wrote. And the specific beat that he wanted me to add was he said, the protagonist needs to be threatened and told they need to stop pursuing, they need to stop asking questions, pursuing the truth, etc. And they need to like consider the dangers to themselves and go forward anyway. That is like a mandatory beat, a mandatory trope in a noir story. And I was like, okay, I don't really know what he's talking about, but I will add this. And it was like adding cinnamon to a recipe with apples in it. It was just like this magic little something that even though I had not known it was missing, as soon as it was there, I was like, ah, yes, it is a much better story now. That adding this particular, playing with this particular trope, acknowledging that made it a better story. So that sort of made me think, a bit more about the way in which tropes are sometimes tropes for a reason, in the sense that, like, if you read the story that just ignores the certain emotional beats, it doesn't feel complete. And so that's a lot of the time the sort of the tropes of science fiction and fantasy are there because they're just a way of describing the things that we're looking for in a story. And that's kind of how I engage with them, in the sense that, like, I want to write the stories I want to read. I want to have the things in them that I'm looking for. I want to have the emotional beats that I'm seeking in the stories I write.
That's great. Lovely to hear, especially the noir thing about Liberty's daughter, which we'll come to. But fascinating as well to think of these tropes as maybe a form of myth that we respond to on a very deep level. Christina, I'm curious about your response to the sort of genre and trope question.
So, thank you, Andrew. I am definitely a genre writer. I've never shied away from that. I've always loved science fiction and fantasy. These days, as an adult, I've definitely expanded it to, like, I'll read anything. Like, I'm almost done with a literary fiction book, The Brothers Karamazov. I love going into history books, biographies, because I am a nerd, but the vast majority of my collection is some combination of science fiction, fantasy, a little bit of horror, maybe, very little romance. um, and that's just something that I've always been drawn to. I've always loved the ability and the idea of just creating these whole worlds, or imagining our world but different on a very fundamental level. And how do the people live in such a place? How do they go about their day-to-day lives? What challenges are they facing that are unique, and what challenges are they facing that everyone can very much relate to? So that's always been really fun. And like Naomi said, I always was a big reader when I was a kid, and there were always certain books and stories and tropes that I was looking for as a kid. And one that I kept looking for and so rarely found was the strong female character, well written anyway. And it always really annoyed me that for most of the media that I was consuming, she just wasn't there. She was always sidelined, or relegated to damsel, and it pissed me off so much. So that's why I started writing. The earliest, crummiest draft of Citadel when I was 12 years old was because I wanted to write a science fiction story where the girl goes, she does the super dangerous solo mission, she cracks the code, she does all this stuff. And then over the course of about 14 years, as I got much better at writing and learned more about the craft, that basically created the book that I have today. And it's really fun because the more you learn about writing, the more you learn about the different tropes, the good ones, the bad ones, and the vast majority of them are just neutral. They're tools. You call them myths, I call them tools. And a lot of times it just depends on how they're being used. I have so many tropes that I absolutely love, but so many stories bungle it, and I hate those stories. And then there are a couple of tropes that just absolutely hate, but every now and then you find a story that uses them really, really well. And so I like using stories. I don't tend to purposefully use tropes unless I am subverting them. Usually the tropes just kind of appear because I love them and I want to see them in my stories, and then I'll be revising them and going, oh, yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense for this to exist in this story, in this space. So I love genre fiction. Some people turn their nose up at it. Like, no, it helps me find the books I want to read. It helps the readers find the books that I'm writing. And there are others who are like, why is Olivia so lonely? Like, she's such a loner. I'm like, me, the introvert, going like, yeah, that's really something weird, huh? And so it's it's some tropes aren't for everyone, but like it's all depends on how you use it. And even though there are so many really good, like objectively good stories that I'm never going to touch because they have tropes that I just don't like, you still respect the story and the craft that goes into it, and it's just a celebration.
Thank you. And extra fascinating to hear that on some level you've been working on Citadel since you're 12. Maybe we'll come back to that. For now, I want to go to Emma to hear her response to this question. Do you think of yourself as a genre writer? And you're playing with some interesting tropes in Inkblood's Sister Scribe. So would love to hear your thoughts.
In terms of genre, I am really fascinated with questions of genre. My students, I actually teach at Macalester College. My students know this. I teach a class called genre. Um, and I find it endlessly fascinating, in part because genre it's like a constant interplay between publishing, marketing, readers, and writers. And like all together, we are what create genre. And really, what genre is to me is a series of expectations that you come into when you're reading something or when you're writing something. I think that talking about genre is in some ways easiest if you like look at a romance novel where we can all say, well, what happens in a romance novel? We can name some things that we could expect going into it. Two people meet, complications ensue, happily ever after at the end. So to me, genre is a set of expectations that we read for or write for. Um, and I am a very wide reader. Like I think my other panelists, I read pretty much every genre out there. And I would say that literary fiction is also a genre of its own with its own set of
Agree.
expectations and tropes. But they like to believe that they're like the baseline neutral, which I think is not true. And I could go on for a long time. I won't, but I will say that like literature started with what we would now call genre fiction, like fairy tales, retellings of things. When you look at a lot of early bestsellers, they're these bonkers travelogues from the 1400s in which people would like travel to lands unseen and write about completely falsified accounts of monsters and mummies and things like that. So anyway, genre is fascinating to me. I consider myself a genre writer. Having said all that, like Naomi, I started as a young reader reading fantasy books, and so my first encounter with the idea of genre was asking my local librarian, where are the fantasy books, and give them all to me. So I read like all anything that said fantasy on it when I was 10 years old. Basically, I read in my local library. So as a reader, I really appreciate genre distinctions when I'm like in the mood for something. I thought while I was writing this book that I was writing just a super basic fantasy novel. I was like, I'm gonna write a fantasy novel. And boop, 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 here it is. Um, and by boop, 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 I mean like 2 years of sweat and tears. But I started out as like what you would call like a literary realist writer. I got my MFA in a place that didn't wasn't super speculative friendly. All my early short story publications were literary realism. And I wrote a full literary realist novel that my agent, bless her, could not sell. Thank God, it was so terrible. But I sort of pivoted after that to the genre that had like made me a reader and really delighted me when I was younger. So I thought that I had just written a straight fantasy novel. Well, not straight, but a basic fantasy novel. And then I found it really interesting how my editor and the marketing team sort of approached it. And to them, it was more like a crossover book, like a book that might interest like book clubs or like upmarket realist readers. And so that was really interesting to me. And I'm not totally sure really what genre my own book is. I've heard it called a million things, like fantasy, magic realism. I don't think it's magic realism in part because I was not like consciously writing in that tradition. But yeah, like family fiction. So I don't really know. I love genre and I love tropes. And in my own work, I always make a list of tropes I want to like mess with.
Mm,
Like in this novel, Inkblood Sister Scribe, I was like, I really want to futz with the idea of the chosen one. I want to play with the idea of the evil stepmother. There's a very nice stepmother in my book, spoiler alert. And you know the tropes of like motherhood and fairy tales. So all that kind of stuff was in my mind as I was writing. But yeah, I find genre endlessly fascinating, and I think anything I write will be a blend of a few genres, just because I that's how I read. I read every genre out there.
yeah, thank you for the perspective of a professor who teaches genre. That's fascinating, and a good reminder that we exist in the a genre for the market, but also these books partake of multiple genres wherever they're shelved in the bookstore, which is fascinating. You mentioned romance, which brings us to our fourth panelist. Tashia, what is your relationship to this genre question?
Hi, yeah, thanks, Andrew. So I just got into a new relationship with romance, the romance genre, and so far I'm pretty satisfied with the relationship. It's I feel like I've actually kind of fallen in love with the romance genre, and I'm considering going exclusive. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, but in all seriousness, yeah, like I don't really engage with tropes. And
Mm.
that might just be because I'm like a newbie to the genre. And maybe I should be embarrassed to say that. I don't know, but I feel like yeah, I just I write whatever the story is, and I'm happy to be a new romance writer, I guess.
So you're saying that you think that the relationship with romance might be a long-term one potentially.
Oh yeah, I'm in the middle of the next book in the series, so
Lovely. Well, whether you engage consciously with tropes or not, people are loving the book, and it's a fantastic romance novel, and very deserving of the finalist honor. So, wonderful work. And want to move into some of the individual questions. Have a couple for you. I wanted to give everybody just a chance to talk about their work. Tashia, please tell us about Native Love Jams. What is this story about, and what led you to write it?
yeah, so the tagline for Native Love Jams is two cooks go foraging and fall love in a berry patch. Find love in a berry patch. And the title of the book, Native Love Jams, actually refers to the wild blueberry jam that is sort of woven throughout the story and is connected to a secret in the story, sort of like the sticky substance that sort of creates tension and just sort of holds the story together. And it also refers to like how a good love jam is like a life that's lived and loved well. So there's sort of another play on the title there. And Native Love Jams is inspired by my own travels as a cook and a forager, going into different tribal communities for, food summits and food sovereignty events. I've worked in community gardens. I worked on a indigenous food truck in native catering and kitchens, and the story really focuses on the growing positivity in current times in our communities to um, strengthen and rebuild our food systems. And in Native Love Jams, it's sort of depicted through the community of Rainy Bay, and they're preparing for their first Indigenous Food Day celebration.
And tell us a little bit about your the two romantic leads that you have here, and how they enter into the story.
Yeah, so the story follows the characters Winnow and Nigani. Winnow is, well, I should say that Winnow actually was the star of my first book. It was a novella called Girl Unreserved.
Mm.
And that was a fictional retelling of my own coming of age story. So in Girl Unreserved, Winnow struggled with understanding and finding healthy love. And so when I was writing, when it came time to write Native Love Jams, it seemed fitting to like, out of all my characters in my arsenal, to give Winnow like the first shot, a chance of like real love and a happy ending. And so she is a independent, much like myself, self-employed. She's a forager and a cook, and she just found out that her fiance was cheating on her. So while he's out of town, she is packing her things to go to this gig in Rainy Bay to cook for this food celebration. And she's also packing to leave her life with her fiance behind at the same time. And so that's how she enters the story. And Nigani, his name actually means he or she leads in Ojibwe, and he is a leader of sorts in his community. And he is also like, for the story, he's like Winnow's guide. So like in that community, and he's supposed to take her foraging and help her in the kitchen and cooking, but he doesn't want to do that because he realizes that she's engaged to Chris. He thinks that she's still engaged to him, and so her fiance basically set up Nigani and created a situation where Nigani got put into jail and framed him basically. So Nigani enters the story sort of salty towards Winnow, but Winnow doesn't know why.
Yeah, well, it's a lovely story. Great central couple. And I did want to mention, in answering this question, you talked a lot about food, about jam, about foraging. And the listener should know that in addition to being a fantastic romance novelist, you are an ethnobotanist, a cook, and your prior book, correct me if I'm wrong, was a cookbook rooted in cooking with ingredients that are foraged. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the Goodberry Cookbook was my last book before Native Love Jams, and that is the Goodberry Manuman is translated as the Goodberry in English. And so the cookbook is all about wild rice, which is Manuman, and the wild foods of Minnesota. And so I was coming freshly off of the Goodberry Cookbook when I was in the middle of writing it when I was, starting Native Love Jams. So that's where my head was at.
Of course.
That's
Well,
where
it's
my head
lovely
is
to see those. It's
always.
lovely to see those threads, or I guess those ingredients, come together in Native Love Jams. It's really beautifully done. Moving to another question, romance, of course, is about a central couple, and we've already talked about the couple in your book, but it often comes with a really delightful crew of side characters, and your book certainly does. So, who is your favorite side character in this book outside the two central folks? And how important was it to you not just to portray two romantic leads that couples could, or that readers could root for, but a whole community that people could come to love?
Yeah, so that's sort of a tricky question. I don't know if I have quite like a favorite character because all the characters in the book are sort of like modeled after people that I know and love, like my
Mm.
siblings, my parents, aunties, uncles, and cherished community members. And but I will
I
say
won't
that
make you play favorites if you don't want to.
no,
Yeah.
I'll say that like the character I think that I've been showing the most love to lately is Melanie, Winnow's cousin, because she's
Mm.
the lead character of the book that I'm working on currently. So she's been getting a lot of love lately, Melanie.
That's great. And it's exciting to hear that you're taking a character from this into a future book. So is it possible that you'll continue exploring the same community, the same cast of characters through multiple books?
Oh yeah, yep.
Wonderful.
I've been trying to like lead like a little breadcrumb through the story so that people like fans of the book will be able to pick it up and like maybe get excited about the next one and already be kind of a little attached or invested to the character.
That's wonderful. And as I said, very exciting. People should seek out Native Love Jams and then also start to anticipate the follow-up because that's really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Um, And you said something about the community?
Yes, I did. If you'd love to come to that, if you'd like to come to that, love to hear what you have to say about that as well.
Oh, yeah, I guess so yeah, like the community represents, the communities that I know and love, and I wanted I thought it was important to give, for the native reader to give them like a positive reflection and representation.
Hmm.
And then also for, the non-native reader, maybe somebody that's not very familiar with our communities and our culture, just to sort of give them a good like insight into, who we are and, what we're made of.
Well, you've certainly done that with an entertaining and lovely novel. And again, congratulations for the finalist nod, and good luck in the ceremony coming up.
Thank you so much.
Emma, let's go to you next and talk about Ink Blood Sister Scribe. You spoke a little bit about the book in your round robin question, but now that we've come to you, tell us, what is this story about and what led you to write it?
Um, well, it is about ink, blood, sisters, scribes. Just
How
kidding. I mean,
convenient, right there in the
it
title.
yeah, it's what it says on the tin. It is about, in short, two half sisters who were raised from a young age to protect their family's collection of magical books. When the novel starts, they have been estranged for about 10 years. One of them is in Antarctica on a research base. One of them is in the family home in Vermont. And then things happen, danger ensues, and they must work together to, do something. And then there's a third point of view character also who is like a privileged young man in a London or a outside London mansion, who's sort of beginning to wonder if his life of privilege is not as lovely as it has seemed. And then so all three of those characters, you know, stuff happens to them and they kind of have to figure out what the heck is going on in this world of magic and books and family. And yeah, I'm not great at summarizing my own work, but hopefully that sounded intriguing to someone.
I think it did, and it's a wonderful book. Anything else that you want to say about sort of what led you to write it? Like what fascinated you about this story?
It I am the kind of writer who it takes me a really long time to figure out like what I'm actually writing.
Hmm.
So I don't remember like exactly when the story like coalesced. That was a lovely employee doing something out back. Um, but it started out about seven sisters because I think I wanted to play with some fairy tale stuff. Very quickly, I realized I am not skilled enough to handle such a large cast. They dropped like flies one by one until there were only two sisters left. And it's a book that most people describe as like it's for book lovers, it's book magic, and the book magic actually came in quite late in the process.
Mm.
Um, so it really started out as like a family story. To me, it was always about sisters and their different relationship to their upbringing, which is what fascinates me about siblings, is that they grow up under the same roof, often with the same parents, and yet have completely different experiences of childhood and coming of age. And it's something that my sister and I talk about a lot. I'm very close with my sister, and I have three stepsisters as well that I'm quite close with. So sisterhood is a big theme of my life and my work, I think.
Well, I'd love to ask you another question. Maybe one that you're not anticipating. I hope that's okay. But you mentioned, yeah, let's get a little bit loose with this improvisation. You mentioned that you wrote literary fiction before coming to fantasy, magical realism, wherever we would categorize this. Um, and then you mentioned family and sisterhood as being something that you're very interested in. Were you tackling that in the literary realist work as well? And was there something that about the theme that was unlocked for you by going at it in a sort of magical vein?
That's an interesting question that I actually haven't thought of. I have sort of blocked a lot of my literary realism from my mind for whatever reason. It's still out there. Actually, a lot of my characters in my literary fiction are only siblings. or, you know, only children. So
Interesting.
no
Yeah.
siblings. But I think that one of like the themes that I have often tackled is like characters going from a feeling of isolation and aloneness to feeling like they're part of a community, or family. And that has really kept up, like from my literary
Mhm.
realism to my genre fiction. Yeah, you know, it would be interesting to go back and look at, I'm trying to think like, what the heck did I write about? Cousins. I had some angry cousins in there. Yeah, angry cousins.
Assign it to your students. They can write a paper on it, maybe.
Oh God, I
Yeah.
hope they never read my early work.
You mentioned the complexity that you were dealing with, initially seven down to two, and then, three POV characters. Um, how did you kind of handle these multiple threads, and bring them together? Was that difficult?
No, actually for me, that was like sort of the most fun and pleasurable part of the writing
Mhm.
process. Hello, patrons of Five Ball Coffee. Um, I had never yet written a novel that I liked. And the way that I kept myself involved was having these three different characters. So, I would do one character and then go to the other, and I got to play in these three different worlds. And actually, as I was writing, I was thinking about each story was its own sort of little subgenre. So the characters are Joanna, Esther, and Nicholas. And for me, Joanna, I was like, Joanna's the New England Gothic. Esther is sort of like the action magic adventure, and Nicholas is like the wretched British orphan story that I loved reading in my
Yeah.
childhood. And so I kind of got to shift genres like while I was writing the book. Um, and I did not know how they were connected to each other at first. So it was also a mystery for me to solve. Nicholas, especially, I was like, I don't know what this guy is doing here, but I assume I'll figure it out eventually. So we'll see. And then it's up to the reader to judge whether I did a good job.
Well, I think
But it
I
was
think it came together wonderfully. So yeah. Well, thank you. Let's move to Christina. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about Citadel. What is this story about, and what led you to write it?
So the short answer is that it is about telepathic, telekinetic wolves with wings on an alien planet. And that's it. And the longer answer is Citadel is the only city, the only human city, I should say, on this alien planet. It is in the middle of what they call the flooded forest because it's in this tidal area where like every couple of weeks the freshwater ocean, high tide comes in and then slowly it comes out, and it doesn't take hours like it does usually here. It takes days. So the forest floods, and in the middle of the weird weather and climate and the all the regular predators and all the normal natural dangers that come with such an environment, you also have what the humans think are demons, the aforementioned wolves, and they have believed them for the last 400 years as like a staple of their religion, that these are demons, they're beasts of hell, they're animals, we need to kill them all, and then we will all ascend to heaven and not have to deal with this planet anymore. And Olivia, the main character, who is a scientist, she's 19 years old. She's a nonverbal autistic. She's an atheist. She's very much an outcast and outsider of this town. She has a chance run in with one of these demons and realizes, oh snap, they're sentient. They're not animals. We should try to talk to them maybe. And thus she goes into this very dangerous, ill-advised solo mission into the flooded forest to start a dialogue with these creatures that, by the way, killed her boyfriend last year. So she's mostly going in there for answers. She's like, why are you doing this? What's going on? But while she's driven by the need for answers and burning curiosity, she's also driven by compassion and empathy. She's like, I don't want anyone to go through the pain that I'm feeling now of losing a loved one to this violence. We're ending it today. And I mentioned I started writing this when I was 12. The plot has remained strangely similar. Like, obviously, there have been a ton of changes, but the whole two or more groups of people killing each other, and then you got the person who's like, hey, wait, what if we like tried talking instead, has remained a pretty constant thread throughout this. As I grew and learned, Emma mentioned teaching at Macalester. I went to Hamlin just down the street, and doubled in both history and social justice. So I was learning a lot about, the suppression of history and how our past affects our future, and how we try to control populations by changing our views on history and the stories that we tell ourselves. And then, of course, there's the social justice aspect of which minorities are suppressed and why and how all that works, and the polarization of groups and the echo chambers and all that stuff. And it just, it all kind of found its way into this book. And it's just like, the main theme is dialogue and communication, and everyone shut up and listen for just 5 minutes. And then you can go back to killing each other if you really want to.
Well, your plot summary, I think, hinted at the at the complexity of the world that you create, but it's all very graceful. You've got a city-state, you've got a made-up religion. This, to me, brings up the question of world building. How do you handle world building? How do you orient your reader to a world that they've never seen or been in before without bogging down the story? What's your approach?
So it's funny that you focus so much on world building, because I always focus on the characters. That's really the front and back of it. When I get a new idea for a story, it's rarely, well, what if a world is like this? No, it's usually, what if this type of character existed in this type of situation? And it's almost always the characters that I start on first. I always need to get to know them first. Like, what is their deal? In the case of Citadel, Olivia, through all the iterations, 14 years of drafts and revisions and edits, the first few versions of Citadel was a post-apocalypse. It took place on our planet. They were stumbling around the ruins of Boston. But Olivia has almost always been there. Sometimes she changes. There's at least one version where she was a soldier. There's one where she's like a 16-year-old teenager running around and causing problems. But she's always been an outsider. She's always been super curious, too smart for her own good, very blunt, very determined, and driven by curiosity and compassion. So I've always known that, okay, so we have Olivia here. She's an outsider. She's headstrong, strong-willed, capable of looking after herself, kind of a loner figure. So by that virtue, that means that the place that she's coming from can't like her, because she's an outsider. It can't like her. It wants to push her away. So that's how you get a patriarchy. That's how you get a dogmatic society that doesn't appreciate her atheism and questions. And so you can kind of extrapolate from that. Okay, I need the person to be this. Here's the world that they have to come from in order to form this. And you can kind of bounce back and forth, like, okay, it's dogmatic, it's religious. So here's how this religion has formed over the centuries and the message that it sent. Well, what messages can Riley, our other character, extrapolate to, instead of being patriarchal and controlling and you do what I say and death to all demons? What messages can he pull from that same religion to be, we should be compassionate, we should talk to each other and listen to each other, we should take care of each other? It's the same religion that he and his father, the main antagonist, is pulling from, but they're getting very different ideas from it, which is very similar to today. A lot of the world building that I do in fantasy and science fiction is very much based on reality. I mentioned history and social justice. Originally, I was at Hamlin for a creative writing degree and realized very quickly I actually love history. I love reading about it and researching all these different cultures and civilizations and people, which shocked me because I hated history in high school, but it's the type of teacher. And I also realized very quickly that it really helps with world building. If you have a fundamental understanding of, here's how history works, here's how governments form and rise and fall, here's, generally speaking, how different people operate in general patterns. Anthropology is really good with this too. Then you can very convincingly create a fantasy or science fiction world with that. And then with exposition, with taking the reader through this world, just keeping it focused on the character. We're not really diving into the deep history of Citadel for kicks and giggles. We're doing it because Olivia needs to know what is going on. She needs to know the secrets of the past in order to fix the future.
Thank you. Love that reference to the ways that science fiction and fantasy, even in very unique worlds, reflect our world. It's a theme that I think we're going to be coming back to as we move to Naomi. So Naomi, I'd love to move to you now to talk about Liberty's Daughter. Like with the others, I'd love to hear you talk about what this book is about, what led you to read it, but with a bit of a twist, because I'm conscious that this book came to be, or at least portions of it first appeared as short stories in science fiction magazines. So while you tell us about this book, I'm also curious about the evolution of the story. Did it ever start in your mind as a book, or did it start as short stories and you realized that you could have a book if you started combining them a little bit? Anyway, go ahead.
So it's the Liberty's Daughter is about a teenage girl who has grown up on a seastead, which is a collection of human-made artificial islands somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. It is seasteading is real-ish in the sense that there are people who are actually trying to create artificial islands, with the goal being that it'll be like this unclaimed territory and they can build a government that follows whatever political philosophy they are oriented towards on those islands. It's an idea that's very, very popular with libertarians in particular, or at least was for a while. So I started writing this during a period of time that I was having a lot of trouble selling novels. This is a pretty common story for writers. I sold some books. I had 5 books that came out in the early 2000s, and they didn't sell well. And then also the economy tanked, as people may recall. And so I got cut loose from my publishing house and was like, I wrote 3 novels that I wasn't able to sell. So when I sat down to write Liberty's Daughter, I originally thought of it as a novel. But then I wasn't able to make myself work on a novel because it felt so futile. It felt like something that would just never be seen by anyone and would languish in a drawer forever. And essentially, I wrote it as short stories as a way of tricking myself into writing it. And sure. And it works really well as an episodic story. So she, she's a teenager. Her father is very powerful. So she's grown up with a lot of wealth and privilege, but she's also a teenager who does not have a lot of power herself. But she has enough privilege to keep her safe up to a point. So she starts asking questions, investigating things, and digging in places that like the powers around her really want to see left alone. And as an episodic set of stories where she sort of gets in deeper and things start to fall apart in various ways, it worked really well. That was how that book came to be. So it was
well, that's a great look kind of behind the writing process. I feel like probably everyone on this call has a story of struggle like that, which can lead to other opportunities, and a great book like Liberty's Daughter. So thank you for sharing that. And so prior, Christina mentioned the way that sort of like study of history and justice movements informed Citadel. I wanted to talk about that kind of idea with this book, Liberty's Daughter, as well, because one of your endorsers, another writer named Cory Doctorow, pointed out in his endorsement of your book that science fiction writers write about the future to make a point about the present. You've mentioned seasteads, libertarianism. I think I actually heard about like Peter Thiel actually had like a real life idea for this. So I'm curious about sort of the political, or what are the things that you're trying to explore about the present in this story?
So yeah, Peter Thiel is one of the major funders of the Seasteading Institute, which is a group that's trying to do seasteading. The founder of the Seasteading Institute is a guy named Patri Friedman, and part of how I first got interested in the topic is my sister went to college with Patri Friedman.
Oh,
So um, Abby told me, like she was like this guy from college, Patri, is like doing this, and like this idea struck her as weird, but as like something that had science fictional potential. So like, what do you do when you're the sister of a science fiction writer? You pass along that sort of thing. It's like, hey, wouldn't this be an interesting setting? And I was like, that is an amazing idea for a setting, because like it lets you play with some of the stuff that like a story about like a space colony would, but you don't have to solve any of the problems like, breathable atmosphere, how do they get there, any of that. You can just say like it's much more practical to build an artificial island out in the Pacific Ocean than it actually is to colonize Mars, like way
yeah.
more, way easier. So it was a setting, it was a setting that I was like, this would let me play with a bunch of ideas and explore a bunch of stuff, like in the near future. And I could set it in the near future instead of like, far enough out that we have faster than light travel or whatever. So the things that I was essentially exploring, one of the things I was essentially exploring with this is the sense that still out there, but was really, really prevalent during the Great Recession, of disposability of workers. That was something that, in the late aughts and early, early teen, I don't know, it's 2011, the early teens, I don't know, that period of time, there was tremendous fear, economic fear, and there was a tremendous sense by people working in, service industry jobs, any job where, your boss saw you as a cog that could simply be swapped out for another cog. There was just tremendous fear of being discarded and displaced and losing whatever tenuous foothold you had in the economy. That was a big element of what was sort of what was feeding into the book. That was part of what I wanted to like think about and write about in the story. Is that vulnerability, economic vulnerability, and the extent to which corporate power. The Seastead doesn't have corporations per se, but it has like very, very wealthy individuals running businesses, which who have like minimal conscience or concern about the people working for them. The extent to which like people can sort of be fed into and ground up by like capitalistic power. So that was a big part of what I was writing about, and that was particularly on my mind during the Great Recession, but it's not like it's gone away as an issue. And the other sort of real world thing I was writing about was the experience of the teenager who is looking around and realizing this world that I see around me is not okay, which I think is a really central experience for a lot of teenagers. Like the moment when you're like, oh, wait, I've been lied to and this sucks. Like just the moment when you realize that like you have a profound objection to something about your world, and you're not going to sit by and accept it. You're not going to accept the things you cannot change any longer, is like a key moment for a lot of teens. And that was something that I was exploring in the stories in general, and in the book as a whole.
Yeah. Well, a fascinating set of themes and a great book. Themes that we do see playing out today. And I think that this is a good reminder here toward the end of a theme that's been running through, I think, this whole conversation, which is the very real world relevance of entertaining genre fiction. Four wonderful books, four great writers. Really appreciate this conversation that we've been able to have today. Thank you to these tremendous genre fiction category finalists and to all of you for watching. for taking part in this Meet the Finalists panel. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards steward organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. In particular, mark your calendars for Tuesday, May 7th. That's the evening that the winner in this category and 8 others are finally revealed. Join us in St. Paul at the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. Tickets are just $22, including process fees. Visit thefriends.org/MNBA for details. Thanks all. It's been great to talk with you.